In terms of what type of poetry, again, I don't feel like I'm that well versed, no pun intended.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corrine from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Welcome, wonderful listeners and book friends, to another episode of Keep It Fictional, your book podcast for book lovers by book lovers from the Port Moody Public Library. I'm Emma, your host today, and I'm joined by my book friends Sadie, Corrine, Virginia, and we have a special guest with us today. I'd love to welcome back Liz to the podcast. How you feeling, Liz? You excited to talk about poems today?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Emma.
You're always fun to have on here. So it's April now, and here in Port Moody, the cold weather months are finally behind us. The cherry blossoms have bloomed, and despite getting a small taste of summer at the end of March, it's almost rain every day. So on those rainy days, maybe you're like us, and you like to cozy up with a nice cup of tea or black coffee, I see you, Virginia, and enjoy a good book. And one of my personal favorite genres to read when it's moody and it's gloomy out is arguably one of the gloomiest of them all, poetry. So now poetry doesn't have to be gloomy. It can be happy and uplifting. It can be used in a verse novel or in an epic to tell an engaging story. And it can even be revolutionary. April is National Poetry Month in Canada and the United States. So this week we are celebrating some of our favorite, or maybe not so favorite, poets and poems. So first, I think I will start. And I want to start by just saying, because I was going to ask everyone if they liked poetry. I actually do enjoy poetry. I think I might be one of the few people here today that actually enjoys reading poetry. It's a genre I wasn't really interested in until I was in university, where I took a lot of British literature and American literature as a part of my degree. And my favorite things that we read were typically poems, also because it was easier to get the reading done before class when we read poems. But that aside, I also just really enjoyed the content and I enjoyed learning about different kind of periods of poetry. I especially really enjoyed modernism, poets like T.S. Eliot and William Carlos Williams. But it wasn't until I discovered beat poetry that I really started connecting with it and reading it more in my free time. My personal favorite poet is Allen Ginsberg, a seminal figure of the Beat generation and an acclaimed confessional poet, writing from the 50s all the way until his death in 1997. But for today, I wanted to branch out and read a new poet, somebody who both my sister and one of my good friends have recommended to me multiple times, and who's regarded as one of the best poets writing in our time now. This poet is actually the current U.S. Poet Laureate and the first Latina Poet Laureate, serving her tenure since 2022. She's published 7 poetry collections now. 3 of them have won different awards, and 2 of them have also been nominees for many awards. And she's currently collaborating with NASA to write a poem to be engraved on one of their spacecrafts that's being launched later this year. So that's pretty exciting. So the poet I have today to share is named Ada Limon, and I have 2 of her more recent collections. I have The Carrying, just published in 2018. And I also have The Hurting Kind, which was published in 2022, so after she became Poet Laureate. And in both collections, her poems contain a lot of themes of gender, of family, of illness, of motherhood. She makes a lot of observations about the nature around her, the birds and the bugs that populate her garden and her home in Kentucky, and then like the mares and the foals that she and her husband visit in pastures, a snake that her brother held in childhood, among many other things. And she also writes a lot about connecting to the natural world, as well as things like motherhood, fertility, and death and mourning. So in addition to writing a lot about nature and about wild animals, she also writes about domestic animals that she has in her life. Many of her poems in her more autobiographical collection, The Carrying, feature cameos from her dog. And one of the more memorable animals that she has in her poems come in the form of 2 aging cats that she and her partner take in after the death of his ex-girlfriend. So, like I said before, many of her poems are kind of morbid and they comment a lot on death and the loss of life. The ex-girlfriend, she talks about the death of her stepmother, and her own struggles with fertility come up multiple times throughout the 2 works that I read this week. While a lot of what she writes is quite sad and heavy, Limon is able to capture these dark themes from a place of openness and a place of vulnerability. She balances grief with the wonder of creation and observing new life as it begins in her garden, observing new life among the mares and the foals that she sees. She writes a lot about horses. They make appearances multiple times being in Kentucky, and even new life for these ex's cats that they take in. One of the things that I really loved about reading Limon this week is that so much of the poetry that I've read, especially from my English major in university, is really pedantic, really dry, and inaccessible to a lot of readers. I think it kind of puts people off from reading poetry. And I loved that not only was Limon's work thematically really relatable, but her confessional style and more conversational language are both intimate and accessible. She forms a closeness with her readers that I found to be really beautiful. One of the major and more personal and autobiographical themes, especially that comes up in The Carrying in this collection, is the theme of fertility. And in the poem, The Vulture and the Body, the speaker writes about the passing 5 dead animals that she sees on the highway on her drive to a fertility clinic. First, she sees a raccoon with all 4 of its paws up in the air, then a coyote, and then 3 dead deer all staggered but in a row with each other. She says something as she makes these observations that's akin to both a prayer and a curse. She says, "How dare we live on this earth?" Then, when she's at the doctor's clinic, he says that things are starting to get exciting for her. And she wants to ask him, "But what about all of these dead animals?" And then I'll actually read the next part of the poem as the speaker's driving home from the clinic. She says, "I watch as a vulture crosses over me, heading toward the carcasses I haven't properly mourned or even forgiven. What if, instead of carrying a child, I'm supposed to carry grief?" So the way that Limon speaks about mourning is extremely powerful. Mourning for dead animals that she observes, and also mourning for the child that she's struggling to conceive. And while this poem is quite dark and morbid, other poems of hers balance observations about death, either deaths of family members or friends, and or deaths of animals that she observes in nature, with commentary on growth and rebirth and creation. So there's kind of this balance she finds between talking about the morbid death of it all and then also talking about new birth, new growth. She writes a lot about gardening in particular, the different plants that she grows around her Kentucky home and how they bring joy and comfort to her, and how for her, creating life can be fulfilling in a multitude of different ways. So, one of my personal favorite poems from this collection is one that's more about womanhood and about the presentation of gender, and how being loved by someone validates her even when she feels she isn't performing womanhood in the way that she should. I personally really related to this poem, and I feel like a lot of other people would as well. It's called Love Poem with Apologies for My Appearance, and I'll actually read it out loud because it's not too long. So this one is, "Sometimes I think you get the worst of me. The much loved loose forest green sweatpants, the long braless days, hair knotted and uncivilized, a shadowed brow where the devilish thoughts do their hoofed dance on the brain. I'd like to say this means I love you. The stained white cotton t-shirt, the tears, pistachio shells, the mess of orange peels on my desk. But it's different than that. I move in this house with you, the way I move in my mind, unencumbered by beauty's cage. I do like I do in the tall grass, more animal me than anything else. I'm wrong. It is that I love you, but it's more that when you say it back, lights out, a cold wind through the curtains, for maybe the first time in my life, I believe it." So I wanted to share that one because it emphasizes that not all of her work is about death, not all of it is about grief. Many of her poems are really sad and honest as they speak to her own real experiences, but they're also very hopeful and vulnerable and tender. And I think readers who enjoy poetry, but also who just enjoy reading about honest and real life experiences, or who enjoy observational writing, or writing about nature, or writing about family and motherhood, would really enjoy Ada Limon's works. Also, if you're interested in reading more contemporary poetry, you should absolutely check her out because, as the current poet laureate of the United States, she's regarded as one of the most significant contemporary poets right now. And after reading these collections, I agree that her work is required reading for anyone who wants to read more poetry. So, if you're interested in reading works about nature and animals, about family and gender and womanhood, about death and rebirth, and if you like an observational writing style with a lyrical and musical tone, then I would recommend that you check out Ada Limon's poetry. So that is my little bit for today. And I think next we're going to transition over to Virginia. And I think I know the answer to this, but I got to ask Virginia if you do like to read poetry.
Well, my experience with poetry is mostly with poetry of the olden days. The ones that you said you read in university that you didn't care for. Those are actually probably more the ones that I'm more familiar with, reading all the 16th, 17th, 18th century English poet in my English lit class in university, John Donne, William Blake. And then, of course, also translating Horace and Ovid from Latin into English. That's my poetry experience. So I've not really engaged with contemporary poetry. And last year, when we did this Poetry Month episode on our podcast, I did a novel in verse. And so this year, I told myself I need to go read some poetry. The conclusion that I drew is that I don't get it. And I'm okay with that. Totally okay with not being one of those cool kids like Emma who love poetry. I'm fine. I know I'm supposed to feel things. I know I'm supposed to marvel at that deliberate line break. I don't get it. It just doesn't do anything for me, and that is fine. So I apologize from one person who spoke so eloquently about poetry to this person who has no idea what she's talking about. Anyway, so my approach for this episode was to read poetry by authors that I already know and love. From the last batch of anticipated books that I read, two of the authors were actually poets turned novelists. And in those novels, I really appreciate their command of language, and it's very evident from their prose. So I thought, yeah, that might be a way for me to go to ease myself into this poetry thing. I also figured that would be extra incentive because now I can say that I have read even more books by those favorite authors of mine. So I ended up actually reading a few different poetry collection. I read Ocean Vuong's collection, Time is a Mother. I actually bought that one because I love his novels so much. I also read Content Warning Everything by Akwaeke Emezi, another one of my favorite author, the only person that maybe voluntarily read a memoir and now a poetry collection. But what I'm going to talk about today is a collection by Emily Austin because it allows me to talk about poetry without understanding how I'm supposed to talk about poetry. So that's why I have chosen that. Emily Austin, of course, is a Canadian author that I mentioned on this podcast on a number of occasions. She's the author of two of my favorite 5-star novels, and Sadie knows it's not just 5 stars, but I won't bring that up again. It is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead that I talk about on this show, and also the novel that came out in January this year, Interesting Facts About Space. I love those two novels so much. And what I love about her books is always like her queer characters and also her way of exploring what it is like to live in this world of anxiety. What it is like when you always feel like you're not enough for those people around you or for the world you lived in. So her poetry collection is called Gay Girl Prayers. And this came out last month, I guess 2 months ago in February. And what she did with this collection is that she took verses in Bible, and she took common prayers and psalms and creeds, mainly ones used by Catholics. That's her background. And she didn't just rewrite them, but she reinterpret them. She sometimes would take a concept or an image from that particular biblical verse and she expand them in order to reclaim these words for members of the LGBTQ community. Austin grew up Catholic, and so she talks about how not only is she very familiar with it, growing up, but also she chose to do religious studies in university. So, of course, she recognized the homophobia that is in the Bible. She recognized what the Bible considers to be the role or the value of women. But the more she dives into it in university, she realizes that this is a book and these teachings of the church, they're aimed at a certain audience, and they made this audience feel so good about themselves and so powerful. It makes them feel the right to dominate, the right to rule, the right to consider themselves to be above all else. And it really is a set of words that have been repeated century after century in order to affirm that group's power and their privilege. And so with her poetry collection, she wants to give that same power and that same privilege to women and to members of the LGBTQ community. And so you have your Bible, and here we have ours. And she takes those words and she transforms those words and concepts that have hurt people for so long into words that empower them, into words that uplift them, into words that celebrate them. And as she called, celebrate the strange woman among everybody else. And so sometimes she will take one of the verse and she will change it up. So, for example, the Lord's Prayer will turns into, "Hey, mama, who are in a lesbian bar, hello be thy yearning, thy drag kingdom come, thy strap undone," and so on and so on. Or she will take the prayer that you usually say before you communion when the priest is holding up Jesus' body, say, "Take this and eat it. This is my body." And so she'll turn it into, "Don't take this, any of you, and eat it. This is her body." And she'll kind of talk about that women's rights. Or there's even one about the library, talking about safe space for people. And she said, "Families are focused on and children are safe when drag kings and queens read picture books about gay penguins wrapping their wings around an egg with the pinions and plumage of love." I think why these poems work, and I'm sure some people will find these super sacrilegious, but I think what it works is that they're not done in a irreverent way. As the dedication of the poetry collection is for anyone thought that they were going to hell. And this is what it is trying to realize that words have power. And words, especially these words that have been recited over and over again, they have caused so much harm. And so she wants to take this and sort of celebrate pride. I grew up with Catholic school, and so I kind of heard these words all my life also. I'm not as well versed in as Emily Austin is probably in the Bible, so a lot of them I have to look up and just see where she was referencing from, what is the original verse is saying, to kind of get her sense of what she's doing with these poems. And I find that really, really interesting way. And I can tell that she's doing it trying to really, like, her intention is to make sure that there is something just as powerful for the LGBTQ community. And I think that really, really shows through. And I think that's why the collection works. Interestingly enough, the Amaze's collection also focused on religion and spirituality, and many of the poems sort of took the story of Mary and Jesus, Auntie-Mary, as Amaze calls her, and talk about like their relationship with their own family kind of thing. So it's really interesting to see, just happen to be both collections kind of touch us on that. So yeah, that's kind of all I've got for this episode. And next year, Emma, if we were to do this again, you have to remind me of two names: Chuya Nakahara and Dobo Kunikida. Those are the poets you're going to have to tell me that I should be reading, or just give up and go read a novel in verse.
I will absolutely remember Chuya. For those of you that don't know, Chuya Nakahara and Kunikida are characters in a manga and anime that both me and Virginia really enjoy. All the characters are named after authors and poets. It's really great. It's called Bungo Stray Dogs. Everyone should read it. And Chuya is my favorite. So, like, absolutely, that's who we'll read next year. We'll do a whole Chuya episode. Thank you so much for that. Gay Girl Pervs is a book I haven't read yet. I haven't read any Emily Austin yet, but it's been on my radar for a while. And it absolutely seems like something I would enjoy as a queer woman, as someone who went to church as a kid, but definitely did not really connect with it. And just like as someone who enjoys poetry. And Virginia, I know you said that you don't like poetry and you wouldn't be eloquent, but I fully disagree. I think you were very eloquent as you described it. And you definitely sold the book to me. So hopefully you sold it to some of our listeners as well. Perfect. I think next we will jump over to Sadie. And Sadie has the only verse novel amongst all of our selections. So let's hear about that. Oh, but first, I want to ask Sadie if you do enjoy poetry, if that's your thing.
No, it's not. I think that in my experience, most of the poetry that I have engaged with is more of the epic poems, like the Odyssey, the Iliad, that kind of thing, from my theater degree. Definitely plays often have a lot of poetry in them. So I've engaged with it in ancient Greek theater, things like that. And I think that that's the work I enjoy because it has a plot. I need things with a plot. I struggle when things don't have a plot. And so I need some sort of through line. And so I think that might be one of the reasons why I don't usually engage with poetry. But I have found that I do enjoy novels in verse. I don't usually seek them out. So I didn't have a huge kind of back catalog to draw from for this topic, but we have done these episodes before. And so I have had the opportunity, much like Virginia last year, I read another novel in verse. I didn't actually end up being on the episode last year. I don't remember why, but this year I decided to just stick with what I know, Virginia, and that was another novel in verse. So the book that I chose today, I actually discovered last year. I found this author's first novel in verse that I read, and she writes historical fiction, usually centering around World War II, which is a time in history that I am very interested in. I really enjoy reading kind of stories from the war. So I read her first novel, White Rose, last year, and it was really good, but oh boy, was it sad and so very depressing. And I don't always enjoy that kind of novel as either, but it made sense because it was based on a true story. And so you couldn't give the characters happy endings because they didn't get one in real life. And so it was a very accurate portrayal of these characters' lives. So for this year, I decided that I would try her second novel. It's also set kind of around World War II. This one is pre-World War II. And the cover had more of a cabaret vibe to it than the first one. So I hoped that maybe it would bring me more into the world of smoky, sultry underground clubs and not as much into the cold, hard jail cells and executions. So the book that I chose is The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin by Kip Wilson. So it is February 1932 in Berlin, Germany. Hilda has just turned 18, and so she is finally leaving the orphanage that she has lived in for the last 8 years, ever since her mother died of influenza. She has nowhere to go, hardly any money, no prospect of a job or a place to live or anything really. However, Hilda is walking away from that orphanage with her head held high and without looking back. This is the same thing that Gretchen, Hilda's girlfriend, had done 6 months earlier, telling Hilda that she would write when she got settled. However, Hilda has not heard a word from Gretchen since she left. She imagines that Gretchen has already started her long-desired career as a star on the silver screen, just like Marlene Dietrich, a career and a life that Hilda realizes now she was never really meant to be a part of, even though the two of them had made these plans and these dreams together. And so Hilda is on her own. She's trying to find work so that she can afford a place to live or at least a meal. And she spends her first night out of the orphanage sleeping in the park after being turned away again and again from each business she enters. As her second day of searching is looking like it's going to be very much like the first, and when the rain starts to pour and pour and pour, Hilda's thoughts start drifting to her mother. Even though she's been gone 8 years, Hilda still hears her beautiful voice singing in her ear, pushing her forward. And as the rain starts to mix with Hilda's tears, she sees a light at the end of the street. She stumbles down the block until she arrives at a glass door. The words, Cafe Lila, scrawled across it. Hilda is drawn inside. The music, the laughter, the warm bodies, a welcoming embrace after being cold and soaking wet on the street. Cafe Lila is like nothing Hilda has ever experienced. It's vibrant. It's filled with music and love and happiness and women with red lips and short skirts drinking champagne. She realizes how out of place she is in her dripping, tattered clothes. And so she's just about to turn around and go out the door when she knocks into another woman. Perfect, dark hair in a stylish bob, a breathtaking, warm smile. She introduces herself as Rosa and immediately drags Hilda over to the bar to get her a towel and a glass of champagne, disappearing almost immediately again, kissing Hilda on the cheek as she goes and telling her to enjoy the show. Hilda stands in amazement, drinking her champagne as Rosa reappears, this time on stage. She is captivating as she dances and sings her way across the stage, winking at the audience. While she can hardly tear her focus away from Rosa, Hilda too starts to look at the audience and realizes that the nuns who ran her orphanage would certainly not approve of this club. Men in dresses, women in trousers, people who defy definition entirely. Women in tight embraces, kissing and touching each other. Cafe Lila welcomes them all, and Hilda has never felt more at home in all of her life. When Rosa rushes from the stage, yelling at Hilda that she'd love to talk, but their other waitress quit on them and they have no one to cover, so she has to serve the tables too. Hilda sees her opening. She jumps in to offer her help. Thrilled, Rosa and Brigitte, the bartender, eagerly agree, and Hilda starts waiting tables immediately. She works through the night, serving table after table, almost collapsing when the stage lights are finally dimmed, the piano is pushed to the side of the room, and the audience finally leaves. Hilda is exhausted, but she's happier than she's been in a really long time. However, her happiness fades when she realizes that even though she does have a job, she won't get a paycheck for another week, and she still doesn't have a place to live. However, as they leave the club, Rosa offers her another lifeline. "You can come home with me tonight," she says. "My aunt's used to me bringing home strays." And just like that, Hilda has found not just a job, but a home and a family. Over the next week, Hilda becomes more at home at Cafe Lila. On her second night, she's introduced to Uta, the pianist and Brigitte's partner, and eventually she meets Emil, the owner of the cafe, and his boyfriend Eric. She finds her groove serving tables, getting to know the regulars, and each night she is surprised when Rosa links arms with her and they walk home together. The question of whether Hilda will be staying with Rosa and her Tante Esther for another night never really needs to be brought up. Friday finally arrives, and while her paycheck is in the forefront of her mind, Hilda is surprised when, before they leave for work, Rosa asks if Hilda would like to join her and her aunt for Shabbat. Being raised Christian, Hilda is not familiar with the celebration, but she immediately says yes, she would love to. They light candles, say a blessing, and share small cups of wine and soft challah. It is beautiful and peaceful, and Hilda has never felt more at home in her life. However, outside of the welcome of Tante Esther's house and the warmth of Cafe Lila, Berlin is on the verge of political upheaval. There's an election, and as Hitler's Nazis start to get more followers, the city begins to feel less and less safe for Hilda and her new family. Everywhere Hilda and Rosa go, the streets are being patrolled by the brown shirts of Hitler's soldiers. The rallies in support of the Nazi Party are happening more frequently and with more and more people in attendance. But Hitler hasn't won yet. The election is still to come, and there's still hope. So Hilda does her best to avoid the brown shirts when she sees them, to enjoy her nights at the club and her days spent by Rosa's side, as the two women get to know each other better as friends and, as Hilda hopes, maybe as something more. However, the Nazi Party grows stronger. There's more focus being put onto clubs like Cafe Lila, clubs that the Nazis deem immoral, places that must be eradicated, along with those that inhabit them. When Cafe Lila itself becomes the direct focus of this negative and dangerous attention, Hilda and Rosa must figure out if it is safe for them to stay in Berlin, or if they, like so many others, will be forced to leave the only home that they've ever known. This book is, in a way, terrifyingly timely. It portrays a time in Berlin that was both very open and welcoming, when the queer community had huge freedoms to express themselves however they chose. There were clubs and venues all over Berlin where people could go and celebrate just being them. But it was also a time of political unrest. There was lots of unemployment and financial insecurities. And as Hitler came into power, the freedoms that queer people and Jewish people and any person who didn't fit into the mold had were taken away. It became an exceedingly terrifying and dangerous time. I think that we can see a lot of parallels between this time and our own time. We're in a time where the LGBTQ community is gaining support and visibility and freedom to be out and in the open and be themselves. And at the same time, we're seeing such horrible acts of violence and hatred against this community and against other communities as well. And I know I'm not the first to wonder and to worry where that means our world is heading. That being said, I think that Kip Wilson did provide a hopeful story in The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin. She focuses quite strongly on the connection and on the love between Hilda and Rosa and their found family. And I think that that kind of lifted up those dark moments a little bit. I really enjoyed the story and the characters. It was an interesting time period to read about. I've read a lot of World War II, but I haven't read a lot of pre-World War II set in Germany, kind of looking at the rise of Hitler and kind of how that happened and how kind of the progression of it. Not a long book, which made shorter by the writing style, but I think that Kip Wilson did a really good job of giving Hilda a journey that she goes on. She grows and she changes and she develops as she starts to kind of find herself more and take her place in the world. I really appreciated that Hilda's queerness was never a question. It was always a given in her life and not something that she ever struggled with. Even finding her community was not something that was difficult for her to do. It was there and it welcomed her with open arms right from the beginning. I think that the novel and verse format worked really well for this book. It's written in a free form kind of style. And since a lot of the book takes place in a club where there's music and singing and dancing, I think that this style just kind of mirrored that focus in all the right ways. And it made the text read very much like lyrics of a song, which many of are included in the book as well. As I said at the beginning, I definitely don't gravitate towards novels in verse, but they really are enjoyable to read. You get a really big sense of accomplishment when you're able to finish the book in a very short amount of time. And I think that the authors who excel at this writing style are really able to use the words and the style to move the story along and make it seem like you are reading a full kind of paragraph novel. I would say that if you are a person who is interested in World War II history or in pre-World War II history, if you're interested in queer history, or even if you enjoyed cabaret or some sort of cabaret style stories, then I would definitely recommend The Most Dazzling Girl in Berlin by Kip Wilson.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Thank you for bringing some verse novel representation to the pod today. It kind of reminds me of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, a like historical fiction about like being in a queer club and being able to be free in a queer club, but then kind of the repercussions of having that freedom and having that freedom taken away. And I loved that book, and I love like queer historical fiction. So it definitely sounds like something I would enjoy. Beautiful. I think it's time for our existential question today. And I know not everyone here might have an answer to this one, but the question for us today is, who is your favorite poet and why? Or you could also say, what is your favorite type of poetry? And I know I mentioned earlier as I was speaking that my favorite poet's Allen Ginsberg. I love that he's a little bit abrasive, that he's like not afraid to rock boats. He's not afraid to like push boundaries. I found a lot of what he wrote about to be quite revolutionary, speaking as a gay man in the 1950s. And I like that he's not afraid to be vulgar. He's not afraid to be messy. And I really connected with his stuff when I read it back in undergrad. So my personal favorite poem by him is Howl, one of his most famous poems. But I'm a big fan of Allen Ginsberg, and I'd love to hear who some of my book friends enjoy to read.
Can't wait to hear what Virginia says. I really love a middle grade novel in verse. I think that they're really hard to pull off well so that they're engaging enough for kids and then also work on another level. So I'm going to give a shout out to Kwame Alexander, who I think writes wonderful novels in verse for middle grade, as well as Jacqueline Woodson, who does books for children, books for teens, and she did some books for adults, and she is absolutely lovely. So yeah, those are my favorites.
Those two are personal favorites of mine to have in my classroom when I was a teacher. I would always give kids that didn't like reading The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. So great choices, Corinne.
Sorry, I don't really feel like I have anything concrete to contribute. I don't have a favorite author, poet rather. Yeah, we'll find out why later. In terms of what type of poetry, again, I don't feel like I'm that well versed, no pun intended, in all the different kinds of poetry out there. I've read, like it seems like, like the others on the panel, I've read things that have been in the school system, that have been prescribed, in English literature classes. But I don't feel like I can really say I have a favorite that's stood out. I'm sorry, Emma.
That's okay. Is there like a lyricist that you like? Not to put you on the spot, but...
No.
Respectable. Sadie and Virginia, do you guys have any thoughts?
I'm going to cop out and say Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Well, I feel like Sadie said, if I were going to do poetry, it has to be poetry with a plot. So I would say it's also I'm more familiar with. So like epic poems probably would be my choice, or like ballads, just because it has a plot. And I think that's why when you talk about lyricists, I was sort of thinking too, I think that's why I'm always a Blur person instead of Oasis person, because Blur songs have a lot of stories in it. And I love the stories that are being told. And I think that's why I'm attracted to that. So
wonderful. Thank you guys for humoring me. Sorry, I had a question that not a lot of people had answers to, but alas, apparently there is one, maybe two poetry friends in the group today. All right. I think next it's Kareen's turn. What do you have for us today, Kareen? And do you like poetry besides just middle grade verse novels?
There's nothing wrong with a middle grade verse novel. I do love novels in verse, and I think there should be more of them for adults. That's kind of like my hill that I strongly believe in. I think that they can be so impactful and so wonderful, and they should not just be kind of relegated to like children's literature or YA literature. There, that's my stump speech. As for favorite, I like poetry, except I don't usually go out of my way to read it. Sometimes it just lands in my lap and I'm like, oh, wasn't that fun? And then I never think about doing any more poetry until the next one just kind of lands in my lap or I'm forced to read it for this podcast. But I don't mind it. I think that, a poem can be very powerful in a way that prose can't. As Virginia kind of mentioned, that kind of like one incisive line that kind of like sums up everything and makes you feel and has all that impact. I think that poetry has a really special way of doing that, I think. So yes, I am a poetry fan, except I don't go out of my way to do a lot of it. Book of poetry that I am bringing to the podcast today is one that for inexplicable reasons I had on hold. And so it was at my house. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'm reading this book. I have no idea why I put this on hold. I don't usually put books of poetry on hold. Maybe I was like preparing for this podcast, but that never happened. So that clearly cannot be the case. But there it was at my house. And so I was very pleased that I didn't have to go running around the library searching for a book of poetry. But thankfully, they're all in the same section. If you too are conscripted into doing a podcast about poetry for work-related reasons. Anyways, one of the Goodreads review for this book of poetry by Alex Jimenez says, Taylor Swift needs to sit down because Diana Koi Nguyen is the real chairman of the Tortured Poet Department. I don't know how you feel about that, Emma.
I mean, the Tortured Poets Department is her new album that's coming out in April, so I have no thoughts on it yet.
Perfect. I thought it was a very nice review because that's what this is. So Diana Koi Nguyen's follow-up to her 2018 National Book Award nominee, Ghost of, is Root Fractures. She is a multimedia artist. She does videos and photos and poetry. And this collection kind of continues the theme of familial relations, but kind of thinking about the idea or kind of theme of that root that stretches down into the ground. The roots that stretch into the ground kind of mimicking her mother's experience after the fall of Saigon, where her and her mother and her sisters were forced to live underground until they could be evacuated to America. It's also the idea or image of kind of taking new roots. So when her father left war-torn Vietnam and kind of made new roots in California. She is the daughter of Vietnamese refugees who landed in America and really talks about the impact that that had on her extended family. So again, that idea that those roots are not just the immediate family, but going back and back and back into generations. It talks about her parents, her grandparents, her siblings, the grief that they have all carried throughout generations, and the grief that ultimately took her brother's life. It kind of has a cycle of poems that she explores in different ways and different themes. She has them titled all the same and then explores them again throughout the book. Misinformation, tug, domoy, revisiting the themes over and over again in different ways. She is also a teacher. And when asked about why she likes to teach about poetry, she kind of corrected the person and says that she teaches poetics. When I say poetics, I'm referring to the practice of making poetry, which is not necessarily a poem on the page, she said. Poetics is the consideration of attention, listening, noticing, and perceiving the world. It asks, what's going on in your mind and your body? What decisions will you make as you create? And she has noticed her family. And again, that fracturing of the roots, both familial within her own unit, historical within the context of her family's experience, the cultural disconnect that she feels as a Vietnamese American versus people who she considers as kind of real Vietnamese, the fractures between intimate relationships when they don't understand or can't connect. She wrote this collection over a couple of years in what she calls 30 days of intense poetry. She collected all of these poems, many of them that kind of long cycle or theme that she revisited them, and then left her child with her parents to go to the public library to compile them in a way that felt true and good to her. Her biggest consideration when she was writing is, and I quote, "Did I give fair treatment to the living and the deceased members of my family without making concessions of my own truth? It's so hard to balance family and one's work, especially when we do not view shared history in the same way." Her poems are very autobiographical, talking about her family experience, talking about the struggles, talking about those fractures. She has like a wonderfully succinct and incisive way. One of her poems is, "In my country, my mother says, a child shows love by listening to her parents without questions. But what if the parents are wrong?" Again, she's so incisive and so clever with her words that sometimes you just kind of have to sit back. I will be totally honest that I did not always understand what was being said by the poems, but I could appreciate them on an emotional level nonetheless. She again comes back to just like this idea of her family and who she is and where she is, and this wonderful metaphor of the roots. I think I'm definitely going to check out her earlier collection because within the poem itself, she really plays with convention. She's definitely someone who appreciates E. E. Cummings, so kind of playing with format. A lot of the poems are concrete poems. So talking about like a poem that should be a block of text, but there's a big hole in the middle missing of blank space. In her previous collection and this one as well, there's a lot of family photos. And before her brother's passing, he went in and cut himself out of all of the family photos. And she uses those in her poetry to talk about the family and to talk about their experience. So she's really using that multimedia background to make it both a work of literary art and a piece of visual art, which I really appreciated. So if you are looking for someone who can give you like a real shake up moment with simple words like a whole is a whole, but none of them are the same, I would definitely recommend going out and finding this new collection. I now realize why I put it on hold. It's because it was published in January of this year, and I'm trying to have some books for my top 10 of the year. So I definitely did this, but also would recommend, and I'm definitely going to check out her previous collection as well. And if you're looking for like a poet to follow, you should definitely check out Diana Koi Nguyen's Root Fracture.
Thank you so much, Karine. That was lovely. I think now we're transitioning over to our special guest. So, Liz, what poems do you have for us today? And do you like poetry?
I'm going to go to my fallback response, which is it depends. It depends on how I'm feeling. It depends on the poet. It depends on the content. So it depends. So I need to be in the mood for poetry. And it's not something that I normally seek out, but I am receptive to it. That being said, I will also close a book of poetry and never look at it again faster than I would, say, a novel. So I have less tolerance for poetry that I don't connect with. How about that? Yeah, because there's a lot of poetry out there, just as there's a lot of novels out there. So I decided to join everybody on the poetry episode today, contrary to what I just said, because there was a book of poetry that I recently read that I really enjoyed, I really connected with, and it's something that I wanted to share with others in the hopes that more people will pick this up and maybe also get something out of it. I first heard about this book through the BC bestseller list. It has been on that list for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And the background of the author really caught my attention. Now, the poet is Jess Housty, and they are Indigenous and of mixed settler heritage. They hail from the Hiltsuk Nation of Bella Bella in British Columbia, and they do have family ties there. So that was one thing that piqued my interest. The other thing that really piqued my interest was the cover. I mean, to describe it to you, it is this soothing teal cover And there is a skeleton, a headless skeleton. And through this skeleton are these wildflowers and foliage bursting through the rib cage, green and pink and purple and absolutely beautiful. And I thought, okay, this is catching my interest. It might be a little bit morbid. It might be educational. Let's see what Crushed Wild Mint by Jess Housty is all about. I feel that the poems maybe reflect Housty's background. They are a mother, an herbalist, an activist, a community advocate. And in a CBC radio interview, they said that place was really essential to the poetry and also to their identity as a Hiltzik person. They also view poetry as an invitation to deep authenticity, and they hope that it sparks a connection, vulnerability, and inspires other people, which in this case, I felt that really did that for me. Now, this collection, Crushed Wild Mint, is a selection of poems about nature, about love, and about the everyday, the small things, as well as the big things. There's poems about her late grandmother, and there's also poems about grief. Now, the reverence that she feels for the land and its inhabitants, both animals and people, is really evident in this work throughout all of her poems. There's this connection between land and body that she really expresses in her words about how we are all of the earth, about how we are all nourished by the earth, and about how we all return back to the earth eventually and continue to live on in that way. In a poem titled Guani Taught Me, and in this case, Guani means grandmother, she says, "Every berry in my basket is one syllable of a prayer." And I found words like this really interesting, how Housty incorporates an element of spirituality in everything. And, depending on your background, you may think of prayer as one way or another, connected to one religion or another. But to her, it seems to be about connection to the greater world around us and how we are just one tiny, tiny part of it. And we play our part and we support each other by playing that small part. There's a sensuality about her writing in the sense that she engages all of the senses. As you move through this selection of poetry, all of your senses are enveloped, they are engaged. You see what she sees, you feel what she feels, you taste what she tastes, like tasting dirt, like tasting berries. And you really get that sense of our place in the world, about how while we consume the world also consumes us. So we are just a drop in the bucket, but we should be grateful for what we have, for those who have come before us and those who will come after us. So I really do recommend Crushed Wild Mint by Jess Housty. Again, as a person who doesn't normally gravitate towards poetry, I just felt that the way she was able to convey all of these feelings that kind of made me reflect about who we are in this world, our place in it, that we should ground ourselves and be mindful of the world around us. I enjoyed that so much, and I hope if you pick up this book that you will too. So that's Crushed Wild Mint by Jess Housty.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. That actually sounds like a book I'd really like. It sounds really similar to the Ada Limon stuff that I read today, like talking about nature and grief and rebirth and family, a lot of similar thematic material. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to say thank you to all my book friends for being a little vulnerable today, sharing some more intimate works than maybe what we usually talk about. I understand that poetry is not for everyone, but I'd like to think that there's a recommendation to be found in this selection for any type of reader. So if you're interested, celebrate National Poetry Month with us by checking out one of these wonderful poets or poetry collections, or a completely different poet if that's more your jam. So that's all we have for you guys this week, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Keep It Fictional.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.